got biographies in your programs or on the website if you don't have a physical program. Bob Ascah and Richard Mueller are our two presenters today. They're talking about the Blue Ribbon Panel, or the MacKinnon Panel as it's known. They co-wrote a report for the Parkland Institute called Cutting Through the Blue Ribbon. I do want to give a shameless self-plug to Public Interest Alberta's newsletter that features the Blue Ribbon Panel report that you can pick up at the closest table outside the entrance. It's very convenient for you. I thought, I usually try to come up with a joke when it comes to these kinds of things, and I thought, well, there's two different ways these guys could have joined forces. The one that actually happened, and I thought, well, if we join their names together, they could perhaps take down Donald Trump, because then you get Richard Mueller, right? But then I'd be mispronouncing, Robert Mueller. I messed that up too. But we've got Bob Ascah, Dr. Bob Ascah, and Dr. Richard Mueller, both who are distinguished economists here in Alberta. Economists are sometimes a funny bunch. I don't always agree with the economist crowd, but we've got two of the best ones in Alberta in the room here for you today, and Bob is going to take it away first. So, Bob Ascah.
Well, thank you, Joel, for that warm and kind welcome. What Richard and I would like to do this morning is talk to you about our paper that I co-authored with Richard and Trevor Harrison, which was released by the Parkland about a week after the MacKinnon Report was released in early September. It was a very collaborative effort. And Trevor and Richard are incredibly hard-working academics. I would get these emails at 9 and 10 o'clock at night, and for somebody that is a retired old fogey, it was a challenge, but it was something that I hope I embraced. I also just want to comment on the background to that is that we felt, given the preordained outcome of MacKinnon and its very narrow mandate, it was important to get an alternative view out to the public. And we actually aimed to get the report out before the MacKinnon Report, but MacKinnon preempted us a little bit. So my thanks to Trevor. I'm not sure if Trevor's here, for his great leadership. Also the assistance of Ricardo Acuna and Scott Harris at Parkland. And in addition, I want to acknowledge the contribution of Ian Hussey and Alison McIntosh in the final product. Now, a question for you. How many of you read the full report? The report we did, not MacKinnon, our report. Okay, so a few. How many of you have read the executive summary? Okay, that's good. Okay. Well, let's move on. Now, in the first part of the presentation, I weave the theme of the conference into the narrative presented in the UCP platform and the MacKinnon Report. Whatever one might like to say about the UCP, they have been reasonably transparent about what they were going to do on the fiscal side. The second part of my presentation looks at the big question that MacKinnon ignores. How can one prepare a budget without some discussion about where the money comes from? To use a family budgeting analogy that Klein was very popular for, there is also an option of getting more money by working harder, longer hours, or getting a second job. It may be unpleasant, but it is a viable option. Third, I compare the debt situation facing the Klein government in 1993 with the situation in 2019 facing Kenney. Then I conclude looking at other critical factors facing the province's finances, and then by touching on a message of hope. Now, in keeping with the theme of the conference, and this is really not so much in the report, so these are my random thoughts in tying the theme of populism and discontent to the story we're going to tell about the MacKinnon Report. I'll discuss the narrative that's being used by the current government in shaping opinion around public finances. The first theme is that deficits, debt, and taxes are bad. These words were employed in the UCP's platform, Alberta Strong and Free, which some of you may be familiar with. Images conjured up include $100 billion debt hole, the fiscal cliff that governments can't ignore. Alberta's debt will amount to $85,000 per family, a 4 debt spiral and debt wall. These are phrases really to scare people without any good context. Another popular theme is that debt servicing is crowding out other operating spending like social services, and obviously that's a bad thing on which everyone would agree. Debt also figured heavily in the MacKinnon Report. Debt appeared 80 times and deficit 33 times frequently in concert. These physical metaphors, hole, spiral, wall, cliff, and crowding out, cloud rational thought, and they are presented as facts, absolutes without nuance or subtlety. They're not advancing. Oh, sorry. Well, let's see if this. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. We've got to. Can you just? No, I mean it's there. Yeah, it's up here. Maybe let's see if I press that. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I was pointing it at the wrong thing. Okay, apologies for that. So we talked about debt. Let's talk about spending now. Oops. The second theme is how spending is the apparent and only nemesis of decision makers. It starts by the assumption that the only aspect of control by government is spending. This, of course, is patently false, but plays to the populist impression of feckless, wasteful governments. The analogy to family finance is the notion that living within one's own means. And this has particular resonance, I would say, to individuals and families struggling with their own finances. Words associated with spending include deficit finance, non-essential, increased spending associated with the NDP, and spending more and getting less. As noted in the previous slide, growing debt service costs, the deficit financing is choking other programs as debt inexorably rises. It is implied that debt servicing charges are non-essential. Premier Kenney and others have opined that payments to outside bondholders are poor policy, and I would tend to agree in a general way. In its place, the UCP offers prudent spending and claims to maintain spending levels in health and education, apparently with better outcomes. Time will tell on that one. Okay. Next, we turn to the discourse around taxes, the revenue side of the fiscal equation, which the UCP government directed MacKinnon and her colleagues to ignore. The language connects the NDP with higher taxes, payroll, carbon, business, and property taxes. The language that's used stresses burden placed on struggling families and business. This framing argues that low taxes make Alberta competitive, conveniently omitting that Alberta is already, as we know, the lowest tax jurisdiction in Canada and close to that in North America. The UCP also took aim at Ottawa in their Alberta Strong and Free platform, fostering a resentment to other parts of the country and promoting a victimhood or martyr mythology as part of the conservative Alberta mindset. Us versus them, again, a key point of the populist thought. And just before I go on to the next slide, just a quote from the UCP platform. Albertans have given Canada $611 billion in federal taxes than we have received back in transfers and services since 1961. Albertans have played by the rules, paid more than our share of taxes, and produced wealth for other Canadians. Okay, do we have a spending or revenue problem? MacKinnon and the UCP believe it is simply a spending problem. So now I'm turning from that rhetorical realm to empirical evidence over longer periods of time. Our study renders a very different diagnosis of Alberta's fiscal position. It is important to note that much of MacKinnon's analysis looked mainly at the Notley years, rarely extending the analysis more than 10 years. And Richard, certainly, his longitudinal study on the labor side is very important. Now, this chart commences in 1981-82, and it shows the various spending. Oops. Now, why did that happen? Oh, God. Oops. Overshot. There we go. Okay. See if I can. Okay. So this shows personal income tax, other revenue, and then this line here that's quite jumpy is non-renewable resource revenue. And we're all familiar with that. And of course, the main takeaway is that twofold, really, that over the past decade, resource revenues have fallen significantly. And secondly, resource revenue is inherently unstable at the mercy of international commodity prices, a fact that MacKinnon acknowledged in the beginnings of her report as playing havoc with budget planning in Alberta. But of course, their remit was not to look at that. Okay, to continue with spending or revenue problem, this chart, we show the tax effort or revenue of the Alberta government as a percentage of GDP, and it's taken from a neutral source, the Royal Bank, RBC Economics. And you can see that it's declined from around 20% down to around 15% under Notley. And it goes up and down, and much of this is related to oil prices. But the other thing is the policy dimension to this. And starting in about 97, 98, under Stockwell Day, you had, and this was a federal and other provincial, a decline in the tax effort by Alberta in a very significant way. And this is, of course, the heralded Alberta advantage. So this chart is perhaps a bit of controversial message or editorial comment that I'm going to make around it. Again, it shows the relationship between spending and revenue as a percentage of GDP over time. Now, there is, at least in my mind, not an accepted level of the size of the government sector to the economy. Many in this room like a larger number, but such views are rooted in value sets, history, public institutions, and the economic structures, not empirical science. It's like saying there is an optimal number for debt as GDP. It just depends. This trend line simply shows that revenue and spending as a portion of the economy has climbed or fallen, to suggest, as some analysts have said, that expenditure levels at a certain point in time are better than another point of time. I just think is debatable, but it's a debate that I think we should have and may be controversial. My point is simply that there are many factors which influence the quality of services to the public and outcomes such as infant mortality levels or graduation rates. Okay, for me, this chart is the most profound of my deck. The top blue line shows the spending less revenue producing the province's bottom line, a deficit or surplus over a very long period of time. And this series begins in 1966, and it's from Kneebone and Wilkins, who've done very impressive lifting to develop a very consistent set of data. Now, what I've done here, and others have done it like Kneebone and Tomb, is simply we take the top line, the blue line, and subtract non-renewable resource revenue, and come to what I call an adjusted surplus or deficit. And what astounded me was the fact that since 1965, if you use that as a way of calculating surplus or deficits, the province has never run a surplus since 1965. My question from all this is, realistically, practically speaking, can future budgets, and I should add that I do have the budget that just came down to 2023 numbers there, and again, under those measures, it doesn't balance. So my question is, can future budgets be balanced and future surplus repay debt by addressing spending alone? Next, I wanted to say a few words about the seriousness of the fiscal crisis facing Alberta. If debt is your measure for comparing different periods in time, there are a number of ways that the debt burden or serviceability of the debt can be measured. The table reproduced from our study examines 9 measures of the debt burden. Debt to GDP is common, debt to revenue is another measure, and percentage of debt service costs compared to revenue is another measure. So in 1993, compared to 2019, in all but one measure, the 1993 situation was more serious than in 2019. This is not to say, and we say in the report, that the public should not be worried about debt, and that is something I would welcome discussion on. Now, I'm going to turn briefly to some other concerns that factor into the debt situation and that are, I think, quite significant and fairly obvious, some of which are not really been talked about. So first thing, the first factor is historically low interest rates. The biggest reason Alberta's and other provincial debt has not been downgraded more frequently is the historically low level of debt servicing costs and interest rates. And we've seen rates coming down from 10% levels to 3 or 4%, and that's been saving billions of dollars in debt servicing costs for provinces, especially Quebec and Ontario, that are quite heavily indebted because they're refinancing their debt at much lower levels. But again, there's no guarantee that interest rates are going to stay at historically low levels. So that's one factor. A second critical factor is the structure of Alberta's staples exporting economy. Given Alberta's unique dependence on oil, natural gas, and bitumen, the economy and provincial finances are quickly buffeted by declines in resource prices. Alberta's economic structure is a negative to the rating agencies, especially compared with other provincial credits such as Ontario and Quebec. And this vulnerability will become ever increasingly important as climate emergencies are declared all over the planet. And I'll come to that in the next couple of slides, work that in. We also draw attention to the quantum of environmental liabilities. This is footnote 14 in the paper, facing Alberta's private corporations. The official count from the energy regulator is 60 billion, but an internal study that was FOIPed showed it could be as high as $260 billion, including oil sands tailings ponds. So just to kind of give you a scale of that, if you just take the environmental liabilities of the tailings ponds and oil sands mines, $100 billion, twice the revenues of the provincial government, and about $10 or $15 billion more than the gross debt outstanding by the province. So over the past decade, it has become quite obvious that the energy regulator in Alberta has been captive to the needs of the industry and its rapid development, or the perceived need for rapid development for employment purposes. I am quite skeptical that even large companies will be around to clean up the mess. This likely means rating agencies may begin to revalue the province's credit rating in this light, another negative. Okay, so a question. Are resource revenues the same as other revenues? And you know, this is a profound question when you're thinking about looking at the bottom line, as I showed you before, of the province, total revenues less spending. If you include resource revenues, you get an entirely different conclusion. Now, a key question then relates to the proper accounting for resource revenues. In the forthcoming book that I'm editing, and Pam Holloway's here from Athabasca University Press, I'll plug the book. We're looking at a sales tax. But Al says something I think quite amazing. The first fight in my mind is to convince Albertans that royalty receipts are not revenue. They are sales receipts. We've had all kinds of discussions about that. We have to tell Albertans that we've been fooling you for decades and we've never had a balanced budget since the Second World War. So this is the Deputy Provincial Treasurer. Okay. Now the next a bit of fun that I had with the book was interviewing David Dodge, which may not be a fan of this crowd, but I think he's an eminent individual, thoughtful, former governor of the Bank of Canada, and he was on the Premier's Council for Economic Strategy under Stelmach. And he offers a related view here. He says, we're eating our seed each year. The other analogy was every year we're selling off a few more acres of the farm, and if we use that for current consumption, pretty soon we're going to be in trouble. We are trying to make a point in the Emerson Report that you can't go on forever and ever running down your capital. We didn't, Mr. Lougheed talked about the resource running out. We didn't phrase it in terms of the resource running out. Rather, we said the economic value of the resource was going to decline. And this is something some of the other panels have touched on. That could decline because the price of the resource would come down, global surpluses in the energy market. Why would that happen? That was because there would be an alternative types of energy developed, or there will be restrictions on the amount of greenhouse gas allowed to be produced. So this is part of the existential crisis that I think Alberta is facing, and our current government just doesn't seem to understand that. Then to the final, and I wouldn't call this a total message of hope or a panacea, but we advance some reasons why there should be at least the consideration for a sales tax. And those things are common principles of taxation going back a long time. A goods and services tax is very broadly based. If you bring it in with an HST, you're harmonizing the items subject to the tax. The other thing that conservative economists like Dalby and Ferretti and McKenzie talk about is the marginal cost of raising $1 of PST or GST is much lower than for corporate revenue and personal income tax. And one of the issues from the left, of course, has always been the question of regressivity. And that, again, could be addressed in part by putting in tax credits that we see with the GST system. It would also require the wealthy, to pay taxes other than really more taxes other than to benefit from all the tax loopholes that we see in our complex tax system. As I say, I don't see it as a panacea, but I do see it as one essential tool that needs to be employed, and conversation, discussion needs to be engaged to place Alberta's finances on a sustainable future. So thank you very much, and Rick, I think we'll get you up to speak about labor markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here today. It's thrilled to be in Edmonton in November, as always, of course. This year, I've been up here 4 years in a row now, I guess, in November. Thank you for the good weather. I appreciate that. Last couple of years, my car died up here. My car apparently doesn't like Edmonton, so this year we brought my wife's car, and everything's been fine since. Thank you. I just want to underline what Bob said. It's been a real pleasure to work with Bob and Trevor on this, and we sort of, the MacKinnon panel was struck back in May, wasn't it, the end of May? And the beginning of June, I think Trevor had this great idea to throw this report together. So that's how we spent our summer, putting this thing together. And we still didn't get it out on time. And I want to thank the people from the Parkland, though. They certainly went to great efforts to try to get this out on time. And part of the delay, I think, is we had to change the tense of the report because we didn't precede their report. So it took us a little while. Okay, we're good. My part of the report was looking at public-private sector wage differentials, or public sector wage differentials. Of course, the UCP, one of their favorite targets right now, and a lot of you in the room know this better than I do, has been sort of attacking public sector workers. And so my contribution to this report, at least a big part of my contribution, was looking at these wages and seeing sort of how they've evolved over time and whether, in fact, they're out of whack with the rest of the country or with the private sector in this province. So what the UCP tries to do is look at numbers something like this. This is from the MacKinnon Report. One of the easy things about writing our report, which is not a response to, it's a parallel report, I think we should mention. One of the easy things in writing this report with Bob and Trevor was that we basically knew what the MacKinnon Report was going to say in advance. There was no mystery to it at all. So what they did when it comes with wages here is they take a look at, what do we have there? Oh, they try to attack the public sector, just not both in terms of the numbers of people and sort of have this bloated public sector in Alberta, and also in terms of the salaries that are being paid to these people, to the public servants on average. And so if you kind of take a look at these numbers, they, at the bottom there, it looks pretty big, all these big increases, right? We know the private sector numbers are falling, and, and so this is a really, really bad thing. And these are all from the NDP budgets. And so if you kind of look at these things, we basically have a cumulative increase of 5.5%, but population also increased by the same amount over this period. This is not an outrageous bloat by any means, in my opinion. If we take a look at the average wages, again, they sort of take a look at this average growth of wages over this period of time of 2.3%, okay, which seems pretty high. Of course, a lot of people in the private sector have been suffering since 2014. We know that, okay, and certainly the UCP is sort of playing that to their advantage, I think. But again, if we kind of put this in context, there's a cumulative increase of 12.1% over this period of time in the total wage bill, compensation bill, I guess, for public sector workers. But, of course, population growth and inflation together accounted for 12.2%. So it seems pretty commensurate with sort of what's been going on in the economy, okay? So what's the problem here? Well, I basically argue that here's the problem, and I'll sort of fast forward this. 2014 is when things went south in Alberta. Okay, so if we sort of look at the, these are three different levels of sort of public service. We have educational services, healthcare and social assistance, and then public administration. These are all aggregated. And then the blue line there is sort of the industrial aggregate. This is everybody in the economy. Okay, so since 2014, those wages have come south for everybody, but they've sort of been stable for public sector workers, regardless of our sort of definition here. We can show it a little more clearly here. I suppose the same kind of thing going on. And so it looks like because public sector wages have been coming down, or sorry, private sector wages have been coming down, it makes this sort of jump in public sector worker wages look real dramatic, okay? And also another thing, of course, that they've been good at doing with the UCP report and reports that have preceded this, which MacKinnon and Mintz in 2017, and I had a nicer slide prepared, but I didn't put it up here. If you look at 2016, 2017, those are sort of the years a lot of times these reports compare. That's what they use as their comparator, 2016 or 2017. And those are not really representative years, are they? Sort of, if you sort of take a look at the yellow line versus the blue line, okay, the gap is pretty wide there. And this is exactly what they're putting in their report. So they're cherry picking the data. Or I don't know if they're doing it on purpose. In fairness to them, they could be using the most recent data available to them at the time. But from my perspective, over the longer term, they look cherry picked. Okay, whether intentional or not, I'm not gonna offer my judgment on that. So let's look at the size of the public sector. The size of the public sector doesn't seem to be too unreasonable here. If we sort of take a look, conveniently highlighted that for you. Okay, if we sort of take a look at the size of the public sector, Alberta's the yellow line. And I sort of did this largely in response to what the MacKinnon Report was going to do, which is compare Alberta. They very much like to favor comparing Alberta to BC, Ontario, and Quebec, okay? So I sort of throw Canada in here too as well. And those are pretty fair comparators. I won't argue with them there. A lot of people might argue with that, but that's why I put sort of the Canadian average in there as well. But we're the fourth largest province, of course, and if you look at some of the smaller provinces, of course, their public expenditures as a percentage of GDP and their public sector, they're huge. Okay, So let's go, okay, maybe I don't like the comparison, but I'm going to go with it just to be consistent here. And if you take a look at the yellow line, that's Alberta, and we sort of had our ebbs and flows. We had this, great, from 1976 to 2018, we had this great expansion of the size of the public sector during the Lougheed time, and then later during Stelmach, blah, blah, blah. You can see the decline cuts there in the 90s, et cetera. But if you look at the two endpoints, we're pretty much the same as we were back in 1990 or 1976, the size of the public sector as a percentage of the population. Even more dramatic if we look at it as a percent of total employment. Okay, we've had a really robust private sector, obviously, in Alberta for a lot of years, and of course, the percentage of public sector workers in total employment has actually fallen during that period of time. You can see a little uptick, of course, from 2014 on or something, and a lot of that's for two reasons. One reason, of course, is that the Notley government did maintain kind of public services and employment during that period of time, and the second reason, of course, is that the number of private sector workers declined. Okay. So, in my interpretation, and I'll there's more data in the longer report that I wrote, but in my interpretation, I don't think we have a bloated public sector at all. Okay. What else? Here's something that's really important that a lot of the reports don't take into consideration, and that's the inflation rate. So this slide shows the inflation rate, the cumulative inflation, or the CPI, I guess, between 2001 and 2018. And I sort of highlighted the numbers I want you to sort of take a look at. And for Alberta, between this 17-year period, our inflation rate was 45.4%. The next highest jurisdiction was Ontario with 37.8%. This is hardly ever taken into consideration when we're comparing wages, at least a lot of the reports that are public right now. And this is a really important thing. The cost of living in Alberta rose more dramatically over this period of time than it did in any other jurisdiction, and yet wages may or may not reflect that. So what I do is correct for this. We call it real wages in economic terms. You're probably familiar with that. And it basically gives us a better idea of the cost, what a wage will buy. Okay, so it's all good and well. I mean, Fort McMurray is a good example, I suppose. It's all good and well to make a lot of money up in Fort McMurray, but of course things were very expensive up there as well. So in real terms, the $150,000 that was alluded to today or this morning wouldn't buy as much in Fort Mac as it would in, let's say, Lethbridge. Okay, at the same period of time. So we're concerned with those real wages, and the same thing for Alberta public sector workers. How do their real wages compare to other jurisdictions? So that's what we try to do here. Oops, I'm going to skip that one. This is all industries. Okay, so this is every worker in Alberta. Okay, anybody who works for wages over the period 2001 to 2018. And this is compared to other provinces. So just to sort of fill you in on this, let's see if I can get this to work. This black line here is basically parity. Okay, so if wages in Alberta were the same as the other provinces, they'd be at that black line. Okay. Well, what this says basically is Quebec, and we'll just look at this area here for now. Quebec has, even today, I mean, the peak was kind of 2014 when wages in Alberta were on average earnings about 25% higher than they were in Quebec. Oops. Doing Bob's trick here. At least I didn't go forward, so right? I went backwards? Yeah, okay. So anyway, basically, any time the lines are above the big solid black line there means that Alberta wages relative to other provinces are higher, okay? And that's what we certainly do see here. And of course, those relative wages have come down since 2014 when things started to go south in Alberta. But this is for everybody in the economy, okay? I can slice and dice the data a little more finely, which I do in the report, I think. This is for educational services, okay? So educational services, and I think I have another. Only Quebec. Okay, do we rank relatively high to, at least recently, okay? Okay, and Quebec, of course, is, anytime we have Quebec in the data, it always does interesting things, shall we say. So a lot of times they're kind of checked out of data sets, even in Ottawa when they do these analyses. But so it doesn't look too, compared to Canada, compared to BC, compared to Ontario, we look low in real terms, right? A little bit low compared to these other provinces and to nationwide. This is healthcare and social assistance. Again, these are pretty broad categories, but it sort of gives us an idea what's going on. And again, at least recently, in real terms, doesn't seem too out of whack. I mean, maybe 1 or 2 percentage points difference is a big number for you, but certainly not for me. So the things don't look too terribly bad, especially, and I think we have to keep this in the context of the overall wage structure in Alberta, which is high by national standards. Okay. What else? Public administration. Here's the one we're sort of concerned with. This is everybody in public administration. And again, compared to Quebec, we seem relatively high, but compared to the other provinces, we don't really seem that high, and to Canada as well. Okay, we're sort of at or near that black line, I suppose. Of course, public administration encompasses lots of different levels, federal, provincial, and local. So this is where the news may be good, maybe not good, depending on where you are. In terms of federal public administration, again, all the lines are below the black sort of at par line, which says that our wages for public administration in Alberta are lower than they are in the other jurisdictions. Okay, I suspect that's because wages are set nationally in Ottawa if you're a federal public sector worker without much consideration to, as we know, caring about Alberta and what's going on here, I suppose. So, provincial, again, relative to Quebec. Quebec's, again, a little bit of an outlier, and a lot of that reason is just because Quebec has a huge public sector, okay? And their wages are not as high. So we look relatively good compared to Quebec, but again, if you sort of go towards the end of the period and take a look at it compared to the other jurisdictions, we don't look too bad, okay? In fact, we look a little low compared to a couple others. Here's the surprising one. Local public administration seems to be off the charts compared to Quebec and high in Alberta relative to the other jurisdictions as well. And I don't know why that is. I've been trying to sort of figure that out. Maybe some of you folks can fill me in on this or maybe tell me my data's wrong or something like that, but it just seemed kind of surprising to me. So I have pretty good news if you're a provincial government employee, but not so much good if you're a local government employee in all this. And again, I'm starting to slice and dice these data a little more finely. This is sort of an aggregate, so we don't know exactly what might be driving these differences. A little more recent data, again, if you look at the MacKinnon Report and stuff, they divide it down into sort of the last 3 years kind of thing. So this is wages. Wages tend to be a better measure of productivity and actual compensation, right? If you look at weekly earnings, that includes sort of it's a combination of wages and the amount of time you work in a week. And of course, that can vary quite a bit, especially in Alberta. We tend to work a lot more hours than anybody else in the country. An hour or two. I mean, this can be public sector, private sector. We work about 1 extra hour a week compared to the Canadian average, I believe, and we're the highest, okay, in the country. So wages are a better measure of basically compensation, right? Because it takes into consideration the number of hours worked. And so we see what I've highlighted for you up there is sort of over this 3-year period of time, all industries, the public and the private sector in Alberta. And again, I think the point I'm trying to make in all of this is that we have to take this into consideration when we're looking at public sector wages as well, the private sector and how lucrative the private sector has been for a lot of people. So for your reading pleasure, there's sort of this one on the left is another Parkland report, which they expedited to get out quickly. It kind of morphed out of the report that Bob and Trevor and I did, a little more detailed analysis. And then the other one's through the School of Public Policy at University of Calgary, way more technical. But both kind of tell the same story, more or less. Thank you. Oh, I want the takeaway messages. I forgot the take. So the takeaway messages basically are that we don't seem out of whack, our public sector in terms of its size or its compensation in general. Okay, we have to keep this in context. We have to look at wages in real terms over this period of time, and we have to take into consideration, of course, that the private sector has been, and this is something that the MacKinnon Report disagrees with. They're basically saying that our comparators should be the other provinces, which is why I did my methodology the way I did. But I doubt very many public sector workers in Edmonton, if they leave the public sector, they're going to go to Victoria or Toronto. They're more likely to go across the street downtown Edmonton and get another job or from the private sector. And again, that's an empirical question. I think it's worthy of answering. I don't really know the answer to that right now, but it just seems kind of disingenuous to me to think that all these public sector workers are going to be fleeing Edmonton and heading to Regina or another sort of provincial capital. I could be wrong. Anyway, that's my bit. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got a decent amount of time, actually, about a half hour for a discussion period with both of these gentlemen. Thank you both for your presentations. They're very informative, and I think the topics that you're covering are ones that I think there's probably some interest in the room. I'm going to start with one question myself. I've got a couple, but I'll start with one and maybe do another one at the end. But the sort of looking beyond where we are now with the Blue Ribbon Panel report being out and the budget being out, one thing that was announced at the same time was that eventually the Kenney government's going to do a panel on our tax system as well a few years down the road. And I wondered if either of you had predictions. Well, there are kind of two sides, I guess. One is predictions on what they might want to do, and the other is what we should do, in your opinion, in changing the structure of our tax system.
Well, thanks, Joel. The first question that Kenny and MacKinnon were asked at their press conference when the blue panel was announced was, what about a sales tax? and MacKinnon said, no, it's not part of our mandate. And then Kenny did say, yeah, maybe in a couple, 3 years before the next election, we'll look at that. Just a couple of other observations. One is that the discussion has become taken, I mean, it's not just well, I mean, it principally is a right-wing kind of discussion led by people like McKenzie and Dalby, and the Fraser Institute recently has kind of said, well, yeah, it's not a bad tax. And so what I would say is that, well, the other comment I would make is that the Premier was the Canadian Taxpayers Federation guy in Alberta that pushed for the referendum legislation on a sales tax. So it's against his very being, I think, that his government would propose that kind of tax, despite the evidence that economists have that it is a good tax. That's really all I can say. I think it's highly unlikely. One scenario that might play out is the pain will be so hard, the economic recovery will not be there. They'll wake up and it's kind of Saul on the road to Damascus and converting to, yeah, we have to find a stable source of revenue.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I mean, I don't like to predict anything. That's what gives economists a bad name. And I don't think my crystal ball is any better than anybody else's in this room. But I suspect what Bob's saying, and just to sort of add to that, yeah, this is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're going to not keep taxes where they are for now, and this is going to be an excuse, 2-3 years down the road when they finally do review it, to basically slash expenditures even further. If I had to predict, that's what I would say.
Thank you. All right, we'll take some questions. I'm going to try to look for some diversity and try to keep your questions or comments relatively short. We're going to try to get as many people in here as we can. We've got a couple of mic runners. Let's start with Danielle in the front here in red, please. No, sorry, over this way, sir. There we go.
Hi, I know you're economists and not communications professionals, but yeah. And it's not, because we all have our different skill sets. That was not a criticism, because you bring amazing data to us. But I guess my frustration is always that we in this room know this. This is not a big surprise. This is the kind of information we've rested on for a long time. But those messages that you highlighted at the beginning around the populist messages of debt and deficit have resounded really well. And so I guess my question for you is how can we work together to help distill what took this long to talk about and that we know very concretely into something that really resounds with Albertans and helps us better explain this without having to, talk about it for 45 minutes. Because by the time we start, people's eyes glaze over, they don't understand it. And they're connecting really well with this messaging. And how do we simplify this and push back is my question.
Well, I think in Bob's presentation, he did a pretty good job. And somebody said the other day in terms of communications, and I know, like, I've taken one media relations course in my entire career. Apparently it didn't stick. But somebody said the other day, just, charts are a really good thing on Twitter. I forget who said it. It was one of these sessions yesterday, I think, or maybe the day before. One chart on Twitter seems to, picture says 1,000 words, right? And I think Bob's slides were really good from the report, basically showing, sorry, communications problems. Okay. Bob did a good job with the slides, and we talked about this the other day, and those are the slides he tried to highlight, and I think he did a good job doing that, just sort of showing that we don't really have a spending problem; it's a revenue problem, and natural resource revenue shouldn't be considered as revenues, as he said. Yeah. What else was I going to say? Senior moment. You can have.
I mean, I struggle with this, and that's part of the reason that I'm struggling with this book that Pam is editing with me on a sales tax and how to. I like giving the history of the sales tax because there was one in 1936 and it was shelved very quickly, and not very many people know that. But it was just opposition of business and individuals, and it was at a bad time in 1936 when the province was broke. So, to come back to Mr. Klein, and of course he has many faults, but he was a pretty good, I think we would agree, communicator. There is people that, as you say, are suffering, that are struggling, that can't balance their budget, and have a series of grievances relating to their circumstances. So what we need, I believe, is an alternative to the Kenney agenda. And that is the Green Plan, I think, that we heard very eloquently this morning. And a message of hope and a harnessing of the state, including the federal state, to clean up all these tailings ponds, orphan wells, to begin the transition, and a Manhattan-like project that is bold, that captures the imagination, that is fair and just. And the question from a financier's point of view is like the question about the Manhattan Project and the New Deal is, where does this money come from? And yet all the talent is there and the resources are there. So I think we need to send that message. I'll just make one other comment. I was supposed to speak at on the sales tax about my book at the United Way to the Red Feather Group. It got canceled 2 days before. And the story was that the timing isn't right. It was after the federal election, and it was after the budget. Story, it's not right. And so, I mean, it drove Pam crazy when she heard about it, and I was disappointed. But it's this atmosphere that we're in, and it's like MacKinnon and Kenney and the FAIR panel. We have all the answers, no questions asked, and so we have to, I think, go out and engage with our publics, do this empirical research, and to come back to Don Lavelle's Harvard's comment, each little drop of the hummingbird, we each have our little part to do, and that change takes off.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I did remember what I was thinking too. We have to think about debt not as a good thing or a bad thing. Better? You people are demanding. My best Don Cherry impersonation, you people. Too soon? Okay, sorry. No, I'm just thinking in terms of debt, we can't think of debt just as debt being always bad, because there's good debt and there's bad debt. And so it depends on what we're spending on, like David Dodge said in the quote that Bob kind of said, are we consuming our seeds, basically? And so if we're using it towards things like education, which is a good investment, a lot of times probably a better investment than giving the corporate tax back, I suspect. Healthcare, all those kind of things. Those are important kind of things, and they're investments, and we have to look at them that way, and we can't just be short-sighted about that kind of debt. I don't think we have to think in the longer term and see what what the payoff is. So,
I was just going to add too that as somebody who does do the communication side of this, it's definitely important that we're rooted in the kinds of evidence that we saw here today, but that we can't talk about finances in the abstract without connecting them to the things that we pay for, which is, I think is what both of you just said, is always talk about the things that we want to do with the money if we're talking about the money. We have somebody that has a mic already back there. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
All right. I'm going to go a little bit into the communication side of thing. I know not the area of expertise, but I'm wondering if when we're looking at these reports, if we could start introducing an idea when governments are going to start producing wage cuts for their staff. It's bad economics for them not to factor in the cost of a strike because it's coming. And I want to pose a question then. It's probably not your area of expertise to tell us what best recipe is best used to eat the rich. But let's recognize that talk of debt and deficit and this MacKinnon Report is class war. So I like emphasizing that the PST is going to capture more revenue from the rich. That's good. But I'm wondering what else we can do under that lens. So an economic question, what tax policies do class war in reverse? Take money from rich people and give it to the rest of us.
I'm going to let Bob answer that one.
Well, I just to clarify Joel's kind introduction, I'm not an economist, actually. I'm a political scientist, but I sometimes masquerade as one. Thomas Piketty wrote a big book, Capital in the 21st Century, and he talks about the transition of wealth from land to an industry, and now, of course, it's intellectual property. How do you grab any of that wealth, the 0.1%? And it's really difficult because we're in an internationally mobile world, and I think his proposal is quite modest. Like, I think 1% of Bill Gates's 100 billion would be, what's that? Well, 1 billion a year. I think Bill Gates could afford that. But he chooses through philanthropy to control where the money goes, which, it may or may not be a good thing. So I don't have the answer. I mean, it's a real struggle to be able to capture things that are on a computer that can be transferred across, the globe to Switzerland or to these tax havens. But one other comment I would make too is on the question of the environment, is that we do have to recognize that we have a role to play in looking at consuming less. And unfortunately, I think we have to learn to live with a little bit less. And that's a really tough message. And I guess, when you bring in class warfare, you're going to say, well, why should somebody like me, I can easily say that I'm comfortable on a government pension. But to the worker that struggles in low-wage employment, they need more, right? So I don't have an answer.
All right. I'm going to go right in the middle of the room here, woman in the burgundy shirt. And then I'll pick another one, too, that's maybe the gentleman in the back row with his hand up. Yeah. So we'll go here first. Maybe we'll take both of them and then let you guys respond to two at a time.
Okay, a quick question. Bob, you mentioned the $611 billion that Alberta has transferred to Ottawa since 1961. I have an economist, right-wing brother, who likes to quote that number. I wonder if you could expand a little on that, because I know there's another side to it.
Great. Thank you. And in the back.
Few questions. So first of all, the Alberta Advantage is set to be gone forever. It might not come back. I don't know if you saw the UFC report that just came out saying our booms have been based on high oil prices. It's never been due to low taxes. I think that just came out. So that's an interesting one. I'm a chartered financial analyst, and I love digging through these reports, and when people ask me how I come to my conclusions, I just reference the RBC information that shows where we're at across the board. And I was also, I guess my question is, the U.S. has $100 billion a month in deficits, so I'm wondering how these wealth taxes would actually play any part. I believe Bill Gates would actually have to pay $6 billion under the wealth tax, they've said. But I just feel the deficits we're running are so huge, at least in the U.S., which we have no power over. But I'm just wondering if that actually could be a solution relative to the deficits they're openly running. Thank you.
Well, again, I would basically argue that I wouldn't worry too much about the deficits. And in terms of Alberta, again, if we compare ourselves to the U.S., we look minuscule, right? At least the last time I looked. So the deficits themselves aren't necessarily a problem. I don't think it's what you're using the money for. And as long as lenders, you said you're a chartered financial analyst, so you know all about global capital markets and bond ratings and debt ratings and things like that. And as long as those remain healthy and people are willing to lend the money, I think it's not a huge issue. And again, I think our debt problem looks relatively small. Again, let me ask you the question, be interactive here. What would you advise your clients to do if you're advising people to invest? I mean, it seems like money's leaving Alberta like crazy. International capital out of the fossil fuel industry. What would you advise your clients to do as an Albertan?
Thanks for pushing it back to me. I don't have clients. I'm a recovering stockbroker, so I just moved to Edmonton from Calgary to work for the Alberta Pension Fund. So trying to see how I can use finance to support public workers. So very new to the pension field and learning a lot. We've been in the news a lot lately, so it's an interesting time. But I would actually say capital is not really leaving the country. I think that's garbage. I think what's happening is you have Cenovus and Canadian Natural Resources getting steals from Total and other foreign players, and they're consolidating these plays, they're finding synergies, and we're actually taking control through the capitalist system of our oil resources. That's not to say that the public is getting a fair share or that the province is earning enough from it, but we're actually just consolidating the ownership back within the private entities in our province. So I can't speak to what I would tell investors. That would be a side conversation, but I just thought I'd add that to the mix.
So on equalization, the work of Trevor Thome at U of C is really highly recommended. And, essentially we pay into equalization because there's a formula, whether good or bad, that because of our high wage rates, we pay much more per capita than provinces that are have provinces like Ontario historically. and that's the way it is. Now, I will say that Mr. Kenny is talking about fiscal stabilization, and that's another issue where I think that consideration should be given by the federal government on a new program to pay for some of the transition over a 10, 20-year period to society in this province, which is more driven by intellectual property, AI, and different things like that, where there's enormous potential, and that's where the new wealth is coming. On the U of C study that you mentioned, I have not seen that study, but I would tend to agree that so much of it is related to the gains in the energy industry, and that it has less to do with tinkering with corporate income tax rates. Now, with respect to capital moving out of the country, Encana moved its head office, and that's sad for Calgary because there will be job losses as people move to Denver. But that was signaled by corporate strategy when they bought a big holdings in the U.S. I regard the consolidation under Canadian hands, the sale by Shell and Statoil and ConocoPhillips, is not necessarily a good thing. That these Canadian companies, yes, they've consolidated, but in an industry where there's huge environmental liabilities, which I don't think are fully disclosed, and these assets are going to be stranded in 20 or 30 years. So I'm not an investor in Suncor.
All right here, and woman in the red here as well. So we'll go here first.
To follow up on what you just said, Robert, you wrote 2 papers that talked about the privatized AIMCO and about the connection to government in setting the directors and the executive management and their exorbitant funds. And I like to mention Daryl Cates being on there from 2008 to 2015 in your tables. And I see that what's going on right now is AIMCO is investing in quotes, in things like Trident, which didn't declare bankruptcy, it just disappeared, like vaporized in one day, leaving 4,700 wells, pipelines, facilities. They just put the money into Parity so that Parity could buy old 40-year-old Shell sour gas wells in Caroline and around southern Alberta. They bought 85% of TransCanada's pipeline before TransCanada walked away. And they want our pension money now. They want to expand with taking the teacher's pension, taking more health care pensions. I'd like to hear your expertise on that, and what are we going to do about that?
Great, thank you. And we'll go to the second comment or question.
Thank you, Bob and Richard. My name is Annie Johnson. Is it the case that wealthy people can find loopholes in a sales tax as well by doing things like online purchasing? And would a better option be a more effective graduated income tax and closing the tax loopholes?
I'm not a tax expert by any means, but generally people think the sales tax is a good tax because, as Bob pointed out, it's what we call the marginal cost of funds is less compared to personal income taxes or corporate income taxes. It is harder to avoid. Now, I guess in general, anybody can avoid that sales tax if they buy online under certain circumstances, right? But you're concerned about the regressivity of that, I assume. Yeah. So that would I don't know that much about it, but I would think that would be a hole that would have to be plugged if that were the case. But generally, sales taxes are considered by economists to be the best taxes because they're hard to avoid and they're cheap to raise. So,
with respect to AIMCO, the one of the troubling things of the 2015 CC budget was the direction to ATB to do what it should be doing, which is lending money to Alberta companies, but also AIMCO that 3% of the Heritage Fund be to, worthy Alberta companies. And now with the consolidation at AIMCO of teachers and with the talk of the CPP money coming to Alberta, you've got, hundreds of billions of dollars of pensioners' money that AIMCO would manage. Now, it's important in the governance to recognize that the LAPP board sets the investment policy. The Teachers' Retirement Board would continue to set the investment policy, which talks about broad categories of equities and all that. Within that, AIMCO manages. Now, I heard some stories yesterday about, okay, well, Kenny's going to use this money to, feed the energy industry that is struggling to get financing, which we all know about. I find that terrifying, quite frankly. But having said that, I just think it's more conspiracy right now, but something to watch, but not something that we should fear for our pensions and get all agitated. I mean, I think we want a reasoned debate and discussion on this, not crazy speculation.
All right, we have time for maybe one more quick round, and then we'll wrap up. Go with Heather and Annika. So Lawrence, if you can pass the mic down.
Just wanted to provide sort of, maybe it's conspiracy, but a concern. Part of the government's intent is to bring in legislation regarding boards and commissions. And although currently local authorities' pension plan and the public sector public service pension plan and special forces pension plan have their own corporate boards that provide the investment direction you said, the government, we understand, is going to be bringing in legislation to have an ability to, again, go back to manipulating and controlling who is on those boards, giving that kind of direction regarding investment. So that is a real concern amongst individuals on the various plans, that in fact government is going to find a backdoor way to control by supposed expert board members the ability to invest, direct AIMCO to invest in the oil and gas.
Great, thank you. And I think we're going to see that legislation this coming week, probably even tomorrow, I've heard. Yeah. Annika, quickly.
Yes, I have to go back to my street, and I live next door to a man who has a PhD in economics. So here comes my question. What kind of marks do you give to this report if you put it in a mark? And what is fantasy, and what is actually vision, and what is misleading propaganda? Because if I remember clearly, you pointed out that maybe Mr. Rolf Klein paid off the debt, or was that also fantasy? And are we talking here about voodoo economics, or are we just talking about fear-mongering and this eternal thing, cutting back the taxes and suddenly profits will rain down from heaven? I haven't yet seen that, and I'm very old.
No, thank you for your comments. I think you're spot on. Yeah, I mean, just to read the Blue Ribbon Panel report, it was pretty hard to do, to say the least. And again, I mean, yeah, if it was a student of mine writing, let's say, a master's thesis or something, no, it wouldn't fly. It certainly wouldn't. There's just it was very manipulative, I suppose, the data they presented, and some of the comparisons they made and things I thought were wrong. They weren't, to be technical, they weren't robust, the results. So. View it with a grain of salt.
Just on the governance, I agree, Heather. That's something that we need to watch very, very carefully. The other comment I would make on MacKinnon is just that if you read her Minding the Public Purse book, which I commend to it, it's a political memoir, but also she is a fierce, formidable woman who has an ideological bent that is consistent with the Kenney government. And my sense is that she will be a key behind-the-scenes advisor on building solidarity within the cabinet, because all kinds of S is going to hit the fan in the next year or so, and there will be cabinet ministers, I think, of spending ministries in particular, that'll be very anxious about the shape of things. And just that I think is interesting. And that the final comment is that I've heard from people that were working with the group, and it's very much, I know the answers and full steam ahead, that command and control. And Kenney and his people are very focused, and they're throwing all kinds of stuff. It's going to be a challenging time just to keep up with it.
All right, well, thank you for being a good discussion group, all of you, but give it up one more time for Bob and Richard. And I have just a couple of quick housekeeping things. I do have gifts for these gentlemen. Thank you both. I want to remind you to fill out your conference evaluation forms. We're almost at the end. The final session will start at noon in the main room with Erica Shaker. She's terrific. Don't miss her. So don't take off early. Get in that session. And again, thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.